This is Blackstone Joe, and you're listening to Slick Talk.
If I say I'm an oil man, you will agree.
There's the stink of oil about him.
Hello, and welcome into episode 154 of Slick Talk. I am your host, Blackstone Joe, and I'm glad you're here. Today's episode is titled The Recipe, where I'm going to break down the key ingredients that go into whether or not a longer oil run is doable for you, the engine, and the oil that you're running. First, I want to start the show by giving a shout out to a fellow Joe, friend of the program, also customer, that sent in a sample from their 06 Acura MDX and was kind enough to note that they are both listening to and enjoying the podcast. So thank you, Joe, for letting us know. And of course, thank you for sending in yet another sample, one that looked fantastic from that Acura motor. I may be a little biased, but I happen to have an MDX myself, and it's because of that Honda 3.5 liter V6. Those engines tend to look great in testing, and it's becoming harder and harder to find a naturally aspirated V6 option these days, at least around me. So that was a motor that appealed to me, and it looks like you're taking great care of yours. Thanks to all of our listeners, and don't forget, if you are enjoying the podcast and you haven't had the time to drop a rating or review on whatever platform it is you're listening on, feel free to do so because we would love to hear from you. Now on to today's show. The ingredients that go into whether or not a longer run is doable. I want to start things off by describing three characteristics that don't play the role that I think a lot of people assume they would. The first one being price. Price point of whatever oil it is you're running is not going to be a deciding factor, but I understand why many assume it might be. If you buy top shelf product, you might assume that it can last longer than a store brand or anything that is on the cheaper side. But price point alone doesn't tell you what you need to know. Neither does branding. Just because the label has a certain name that's making certain promises, such as good for 15,000 miles no matter what, or good for this amount of calendar time regardless of the mileage, the branding and the promises made by that brand do not have any relation to your engine and its story. Whether or not there are any existing problems that, as I'm sure you've all heard, there's no such thing as a mechanic in a bottle that will prevent them from getting worse or will necessarily mean that the oil has what it needs to handle a certain amount of mileage between changes. Finally, appearance. What you may think is a good appearance or a bad appearance when you've sampled the oil and you try to make that evaluation, keep in mind that looks can be deceiving. So when you drain that oil and you think, well, this oil looked very good, it had that color I wanted to see, it wasn't unusually dark, or it didn't seem to darken as quickly as this other brand I used. That doesn't have any relation to the metal content in part per million, the presence or lack thereof of certain contaminants. Now, appearance can certainly show some issues, especially when there are problems bad enough to manifest visually, where you can drain it and see an irregular color that happens when, say, there's moisture, coolant getting in. And of course, you can see some things visually like sludge or visible metal. But don't assume that an oil that's just darker than you might expect it to have been, or oil that still has that amber color that you'd like to see right out of the bottle, don't assume that either one tells you whether or not you should run it longer. While there can be some problems that manifest just in the drain, not all of them do. So keep in mind, looks can be deceiving. It's not about appearance, branding, or price point that will dictate how long you should be going between oil changes. Now, the ingredients that comprise an ideal recipe for a longer run, they are quite a bit different. Instead, our recipe starts by crossing things off the list. While one result or characteristic can be damning, like contamination, a lot of metal, so on and so forth, It's a lack thereof that can be encouraging and thus inform whether or not you should be going longer between oil changes. Let's start with metals. If your engine is making an excess amount of metal, that right away can tell you a longer run isn't doable. To determine whether or not metal content is excessive, we're going to start with the engine type. So just to name an example, let's start with the Acura 3.5 liter V6 I mentioned at the top of the show. If you have that motor, we're going to start by comparing your metal content to averages specific to that design. If your engine is making a lot more metal than average, that right away can be a reliable indicator of it not being a good candidate for longer runs. Because as the motor is putting more and more metal in the oil, that's not going to help it do its job of clean or lubricate the engine properly. So if you do have a lot of metal, especially if it's to the point where it looks like it's indicative of there being a mechanical problem, then longer runs than what you're doing are likely not going to be a good idea. In fact, you will probably end up wanting to go for shorter oil change intervals, both to prevent that metal buildup and keep an eye on things. Understand if things are rapidly trending in the wrong direction, or ideally they end up being stable to the point where you can keep things in check with shorter intervals if you don't want to proceed with expensive repairs. But if an engine is making a lot of metal, that is one clear sign that it shouldn't be going for longer runs. But with that being said, if metals are in good shape, that doesn't mean we would rush to say a longer run is doable. There's more to the recipe here. The next one would be harmful contamination. If we see a lot of fuel, coolant, or excess dirt, then that would be reason not to run longer as well. We're going to look for each of these contaminants as part of the standard analysis. So it's not something you would have to request specifically. Even if you don't mention an interest in looking for contamination, one thing we're going to do when we sit down and look at a sample is try and find any sign of the aforementioned coolant, fuel, excess dirt, because we want to always look for them, whether or not you want to run the oil longer. And if we're able to rule out contamination, consider that another ingredient on the table. But we don't stop there. Next up, we're going to want to see how the oil's physical properties look, including the viscosity or insolubles. A normal viscosity means the oil held up well, while a low insolubles reading would be ideal because that means your oil filter was keeping solids from being excessive. So to be a little bit more specific, insolubles are these solids that form as the oil is doing its job of cleaning and lubricating. It's not outside material, but rather the oil oxidizing, becoming solid. As this occurs, the oil filter is responsible for keeping these solids in check and removing them from circulation. So if you were to have, say, a motor where the viscosity is getting pretty thick and insolubles are ending up high, those can be signs of the oil and oil filter having been in use for too long, in which case longer intervals probably aren't ideal either. Now I'm going to move on to data points that are not part of the standard analysis, but they're meaningful all the same. If you request them, we're going to factor in a TBN or a TAN and whether or not they speak to a longer run being a good idea. We've moved away from the TBN in the sense that we do not ask on the oil information slip these days if you are interested in a TBN. Now, that is a topic that Ryan, the president of Blackstone, and myself have covered in depth on a previous episode, that being episode 138, Moving from the TBN. So if you want a detailed breakdown, check that episode out. But while we do not ask if you are interested in the TBN and we do not place the same emphasis on it, it is something we will take into consideration if you want that additional data point. The thing about the TBN, in short, is it's not the hallmark indicator, the one most important thing you have to run longer. It's just that a strong TBN alone doesn't mean that your engine and the oil it's running are clearly a good fit for longer intervals. Even if there is active additive left, we have to take every other factor into account. And that would include a TAN if you're interested in that as well. Knowing how acidic the oil has become will also help us determine if the engine and the oil you're running are a good fit for longer intervals. But as with the TBN, the TAN is something you should weigh in relation to the rest of the report. Ideally, you are a customer who sent a sample where wear is low, that's one ingredient on the table. There's a lack of contamination, another ingredient. Physical properties that are in order for the oil type. And then, if you are interested, a TAN that is ideally not overly acidic, or a TBN that shows active additive left. With all these ingredients now hopefully on the table for you and the sample you sent in, we can consider whether or not a longer run is doable. Now, if all of this sounds like a lot, I would agree it is. And I think that's also a good thing. Even the simplest dish requires at least some care. You can screw up a peanut butter and jelly just like you can screw up a beef Wellington. And you can, of course, do both well. And while we can't assume what you'd like for dinner, we can at least help you take care of the engine you need to bring that dinner home. So if you're interested in a longer run, keep in mind that results ranging from the spectral analysis to the physical properties to the special testing, if you're interested, all of that needs to work in concert in order for us to recommend a longer run being doable. So the next time you find yourself waiting to take a sample and you're filling out the oil information slip, just be sure to let us know if you're interested in extended oil use, that question being on the back of the oil information slip, and we'll let you know if you have the ingredients in place and what sort of oil change interval looks ideal for you and the engine you have. That brings today's show to a close. Thank you so much for hanging with me. This is Blackstone Joe, signing off.
The Slick Talk podcast is powered by Blackstone Laboratories. If you're ready to start your oil analysis journey, visit blackstone-labs.com to order your free test kit.